Sorry about that. Hello and welcome. This is the third event in a series of Zoom roundtables on the collapse of the Soviet Union, hosted by the Neubauer Collegium and at the University of Chicago. And this roundtable session in particular reflects on shifting borders and conceptions of sovereignty amidst the collapse of the Soviet Union and emergence of post-Soviet nationalisms. And we have four wonderful presenters today. I'm really excited to have them all here. Altay Goyushov, Tamta Khalvashi, Jeff Sahadeo, and Anna Whittington, and Faith Hillis here at UChicago will be our moderator. So I'll just start by introducing Altay Goyushov. He's the head of the Baku Research Institute, an independent think tank. His research interests focus mainly on issues related to political Islam, Islamic education, and the secularization of Azerbaijan during the last 2 centuries. He's held fellowships and visiting professorships in France, Germany, Italy, and the United States, including the Bourse Directeur d'Études Associées and the FMSH in Paris, a Fulbright scholarship at Georgetown University, Wissenschaft Kollega in Berlin, and appointments at Sapienza Università di Roma and UCLA. Welcome, Altay. It's great, you can go ahead.
Something is wrong here. So, first of all, thank you very much for the introduction and for organizing this conference and for the invitation. I also would like to thank all of you for joining. So Azerbaijan Republic is a tiny piece of land in the place called South Caucasus. Sorry, I'm going to talk about the nationalism in Azerbaijan. Azerbaijani Republic is a tiny piece of land in the place called South Caucasus. In the north, it borders Russia, in the south, Turkey and Iran. There are 3 republics in the South Caucasus: Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia. 2 of the South Caucasus nations are Christian majority countries, while Azerbaijan is a Muslim majority nation. However, Azerbaijan is traditionally listed among the least religious countries, unlike its neighbors. For centuries, South Caucasus was a battlefield between Ottoman Empire and Persian empires, and in the early 19th century, it was incorporated into the Russian Empire. Ernest Gellner wrote that nationalism is not the awakening is not the awakening of nations to self-consciousness. It invents nations where they do not exist. This quote is applicable to the case of Azerbaijan as well. The formation of Azerbaijani nation started after the South Caucasus became the part of the Russian Empire. Benedict Anderson writes that communities are to be distinguished not by their falsity genuineness, but by the style in which they are imagined. And Azerbaijan as a nation was imagined and incepted by the westernized local nationalist intellectual elite. One of the local nationalist intellectuals, Ahmed Oğlu, who played significant role in the process and who was perfectly studied by Ada Holly Schisler, wrote that Western life in its entirety has conquered the entirety of our life. Therefore, if we want to be saved, to live, to continue our existence, we must adapt our life in its entirety, not only our clothing, but also our mind, our heart, our way of thinking, and our mentality. Otherwise, there is no salvation. So the nationalism was imported from Europe into Azerbaijan. And as Alexander Benningsen wrote in his report for Kennan Institute in 1970s, culturally independent, economically prosperous, but politically discriminate against the Azeri community developed a strong national consciousness, which became manifest in the early years of the 20th century in the emergence of powerful and sophisticated national movement. And this national movement grew into a separatist movement and declared an independence of Azerbaijan in May 1918, using the chance provided by two connected events: seizure of power by Bolsheviks in October 1917 in Russia and World War I. And the ethnic nationalist pan-Turkist Musavat Party emerged as by far the strongest political force of Muslim Azerbaijanis and sidelined Muslim leftists and Azeri Islamists. As it happened elsewhere in Eastern Europe, as soon as these tiny nations of South Caucasus declared their respective independencies, they launched disputes and wars over territories with each other. Independences of South Caucasus Republic didn't last long. In 1920-21, Red Bolshevik Army invaded these republics, and subsequently they ceased to exist as independent entities, and all three became founding members of the Soviet Union, along with Russian Federation, Ukraine, and Belarus. However, in 1920, Soviets to some extent didn't stop nation-building process initiated by pre-revolutionary Azerbaijani nationalist intelligentsia. On the contrary, it was continued and strengthened under Korenizatsiya, nativization policy. Korenizatsiya was an early policy of the Soviet Union for the integration of non-Russian nationalities into the governments in their respective Soviet republics. At the same time, Korenizatsiya declared Great Russian chauvinism as its primary foe. Many things changed after the late 1920s, shaped in a relatively free environment. Globalized local nationalist intelligentsia was replaced by the educated class, whose mentality and quality were formed behind the Iron Curtain. Genuine process led by the free thought and persuasion was replaced by imposed one and suppression. Throughout the 1930s, particularly during the Great Terror, the Azerbaijani pre-revolutionary intelligentsia were almost completely eliminated. Pre-revolutionary literature, which was dubbed bourgeois culture, was banned. Intensive Russification policy was launched. However, Azerbaijani nationalism received unexpected boost during the Second World War. There are two more Azerbaijans in Iran, West Azerbaijan and East Azerbaijan, which are official names of administrative units in Iran. Actually, name of Azerbaijani Republic comes from there. Architects of Azerbaijani nation decided to take that name because majority of the population of Azerbaijani Republic share the same vernacular with the majority of the population in the north of Iran. In 1940s, Soviet troops entered north of Iran, and Stalin sent 1,000 of young Azerbaijani writers, journalists who were shaped during the first 20 years of the Soviet rule and fiercely criticized nationalist legacy of pre-revolutionary intelligentsia to promote the same nationalism and separatism among the kin in the north of Iran. Young Soviet Azerbaijani writers now had to promote the same literature and discourses which they had been criticizing and attacking in the Soviet Union. Suddenly, Stalin himself became a promoter of pan-Azerbaijani nationalism. And in 1945, Azerbaijani national government was formed in Iran. For a year, there were two Azerbaijani autonomies, one in the Soviet Union and the second in Iran, with the capital in Tabriz. However, in 1946, Stalin, after agreement with Western powers and central Iranian government, decided to leave Iran, and central Iranian government swiftly put an end to the Azerbaijani national government in Iran. Thousands of Iranians fled to the USSR. However, Soviet Azerbaijani writers and journalists who were sent to engage in promotion of nationalism in Iran, who were operating there in a relatively free environment, also came back and immensely contributed to the revival of the old-style nationalism in the Soviet Azerbaijan itself. After the death of Stalin during the Khrushchev rule, they were able to ascend to the leadership position in Soviet Azerbaijan. In 1956, Remember the year of Hungarian Revolution? Azerbaijani Supreme Soviet adopted a law naming Azerbaijani language the state language of the Soviet Azerbaijan, along with Russian. Until 1989, Azerbaijan was the only Soviet Muslim republic where the local language was a state language. And the heyday of this revived nationalism happened in the spring of 1967. With the lobbying of the local nationalist Communist Party leadership, Azerbaijanis were allowed to officially celebrate Nowruz, Azerbaijani traditional holiday of Iranian origin, in the streets of Baku. Nowruz, which was dubbed as a religious holiday by the Soviets, had been prohibited since 1930s. Remember, it was a year before the bloody events in Czechoslovakia. Now, when in the 1968, in the West, social conflicts escalated and leftists and liberals rebelled against the bureaucracy and the establishment, in the Soviet Union and in general socialist world, nationalist movements became primary opponents of the ruling communist elite. While in the West, left and liberals were dominating universities and academia, in the socialist world, nationalist intelligentsia became the most popular force in the universities and academia. It was the case in Azerbaijan as well. In 1970s, Soviet authorities arrested pan-Turkish nationalist professor of Middle Eastern Studies Abulfaz Elchibey, who later adopted the nickname Elchibey, which means a messenger. In 1987, first mass protests shook the streets of Baku. Started as anti-Armenian protests over the territorial disputes and sometimes turned into violence, these protests soon were transformed into anti-Soviet demonstrations. In December 1989, some pan-Azerbaijani nationalist protesters dismantled the border fences between Iran and Azerbaijan. Informal organizations called Popular Front, led by the aforementioned Professor Elchibey, which enjoyed enormous public support, emerged as a rival of the ruling Communist Party and the leader of these demonstrations. In January 1990, Soviet troops entered Baku to quell demonstrations staged by the Popular Front. The killing of more than 100 civilians by the Soviet army outraged the public and alienated the vast majority of the population from the Soviet leadership. The Leah of Martyrs, which was erected almost immediately after the events in a burial site, became the most important marker of public consciousness during the post-Soviet period. Since then, on every January 20th, hundreds of thousands of Azerbaijanis have been visiting the Allee to commemorate those tragic events. Soviet Union broke up in 1991, and in 1992, Popular Front overthrew the last communist leader of Azerbaijan, and Elchibey became the president of the republic. Once more, ethno-nationalism became most popular belief in the country, pushing aside the left and Islamism. We in the South Caucasus returned to 1918 to start over. So the collapse of the Soviet Union was not an end of history, it was just beginning. In fact, in all of the South Caucasus, nationalist dissident professor ascended to power. In Georgia, professor of literature and writer Gamsahurdia, and in Armenia, professor of Middle Eastern Studies, Ted Petrosyan became president. And as a consequence, wars broke out. However, all of them were later forced to leave power. One of the first decrees of Popular Front rule in Azerbaijan was renaming the national language of Azerbaijan into Turkish. Elchibey also managed to negotiate with President Yeltsin withdrawal of Russian troops from Azerbaijan. Yet Elchibey was overthrown a year later in a military coup, and Heydar Aliyev, former Soviet Politburo member and the Soviet leader of Azerbaijan in the 1970s, returned to power. But after his return to power, despite his previous communist beliefs, this time Aliyev joined the ranks of those promoting the nationalist creed. However, there is difference between Elchibey and the Heydar Aliyev style of ethnic nationalism in Azerbaijan. Elchibey's nationalism was vocally pan-Turkist and anti-Soviet, while Aliyev's version of nationalism is called Azerbaijanism, and it was developed during the Soviet times. When Aliyev returned to power in 1993, he restored the official name Azerbaijani to the state language. So local language was officially named Azerbaijani language again. Aliyev also signed a ceasefire with Armenia. However, by then, Azerbaijan lost many territories. Yet the most important thing is that Aliyev made Azerbaijan unique among all the post-Soviet and post-socialist states. Remember Benedict Anderson's quote, communities are to be distinguished not by their falsity genuineness, but by the style in which they are imagined. Traditionally, nationalisms led by middle class were in opposition to monarchies, aristocracy, clergy, whatever. However, Aliyev-style nationalism imagined post-Soviet Azerbaijan as an absolutist monarchy. In 2003, Heydar Aliyev's son, Ilham Aliyev, replaced his father as the president of Azerbaijan. It was the first and so far the only dynastic transfer of power in the post-Soviet, post-socialist space in Europe. I think it has chances to be repeated in some other post-Soviet countries as well. Aliyev's son immediately started building a cult of personality around his father's memory. Lenin's pictures and quotes were replaced with quotes and pictures of Aliyev's father, who was named founder of the nation. And in 2017, the son president appointed his spouse as the first vice president of the country. And thus, transformation of the former Soviet Republic into a nationalist absolutist monarchy has been effectively concluded. And it proved itself a very successful one. Throughout these years, the public was resisting the monarchy, albeit without success. However, last year, Aliyev conducted very successful 44 days war against Armenia and regained much of the territories lost in the 1990s. Now his approval ratings reached highest point in history. Yet Russian troops, which left that country 20 years ago during Elchibey's rule, are back on Azerbaijani soil again, this time as peacekeepers. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Altay.
Did I stop sharing? No, it's okay.
Great. Thank you so much, Altay. Our next speaker today is Tamta Khalvashi, who is professor of anthropology at Ilia State University and the head of the doctoral program. The header of the doctoral program in social and cultural anthropology. She was previously a Fulbright postdoctoral scholar at New York University and assistant professor at Free University of Tbilisi. Her research explores nationalist cosmologies, effective forms of marginality, and neoliberal urban transformation in Georgia. Khalvashi is currently completing the manuscript Peripheral Affect, Marginality, Modernity, and Shame in a coastal city that explores theoretical questions about shame as a distinct form of marginality in Batumi, Ajara. And she's working also on a documentary film entitled Adrift, an autobiographical reflection on spatial and temporal transformation in the Black Sea. Thank you, Tamta. Please go ahead.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Leah, for your presentation and introduction, first of all. And you can see my presentation, right? Yes. So first of all, I'm grateful to Leah and Faith, of course, for the conception of this intellectually stimulating event, and to all the speakers who participate and share their work on this panel. It's always inspiring to see how one works take off from another, and how we all during and after these kinds of events might weave in and out of one another's knowledge. But I guess that was also anticipated in the invitation to this event, which asks for the commentary on the interpretation of sovereignty and borders amid the collapse of the Soviet Union. So my presentation today is entitled as follows, as you can see from the screen, Peripheral Affect or the Shame Left by the Autonomy in the Republic of Georgia. And in order to grasp what I mean by this title, well, let me start by taking you to the period in Georgia when the Soviet Union was about to collapse. So in 1989, in Batumi, a capital city of the Autonomous Republic of Adjara on the Black Sea coast of Georgia, thousands of locals gathered to meet Zviad Gamsakhourdia, the leader of the Georgian National Liberation Movement, later to become the president of independent Georgian state in 1991. Gamsakhourdia and his supporters had first walked around the city by holding Orthodox Christian and national symbols such as icons, crosses, and flags, as they finally reached the protest destination to address the local population. Gamsakhourdia, in his usual messianic tone, gave a speech which I quote here, and this is the video you can see. I'm basically dubbing him now. Turks are trying even today to remove this sacred land from Georgia. This sacred land is flooded by your ancestors' blood. And what did they shed this blood for? For Christianity. No one should forget that at this border, Turkey's land of darkness is standing nearby, and the whole Georgia is standing across the other border. We won't surrender Adjara to anybody. The conspiracy between the disciples of darkness of the Kemalist Turkey and the imperialists of Moscow should be deranged. Adjara should be returned to Georgia, and the autonomy of Adjara should be abolished. Gamsakhourdia's statements prompted contradictory affects and reactions in Batumi. Some locals attending the anti-Soviet demonstration found his statements extremely humiliating. This event has maintained its affective quality among Adjarans even today, and it is often evoked emotionally in conversations about the Soviet collapse. As one of the attendees of this demonstration sensitively recalled in conversation with me, Gamsakhourdia indirectly blamed Adjarans for conspiring both with Turkey and Russia against Georgia by succumbing to their colonial interests. He not only covertly imputed locals for conspiring with imperial powers to break the autonomy away from the nation, as the men reflected, but also questioned the very Georgianness of Adjarians by evoking their Christian roots. Formerly Christian, but at the time predominantly Muslim Adjarians, in fact, came to be seen as a threat to post-Soviet national sovereignty, both due to their Muslim identities and the proximity to the border with Turkey. The conspiracy for Gamsakhourdia rested on the status of autonomy, which he saw as a direct outcome of Soviet and Turkish imperial work upon this place. Some attendees therefore even left this demonstration in a fury, for Gamsakhourdia's statements once again tapped into their marginal sensibilities of shame and humiliation connected to the exclusion of Adjarians into the nation by their partial inclusion. In this presentation, I hope to show how shame works as a distinct peripheral affect in Georgia, and how it is constantly attached to the status of autonomy of Adjara within the nation. It's my contention that shame reemerges as a peripheral affect in Adjara in the very process of defining post-Soviet sovereignty and post-colonial reimagining of Soviet and Turkish powers. Shame then is an embodied experience amid the collapse of the Soviet Union in the periphery of Georgia. It is manifested in the continuous awkwardness about the Adjarian autonomy, seen as a post-colonial political formation connected to Muslim Ottoman heritage. I make this argument to claim that the notions of nationalism and ethno-religious tensions as main explanatory devices do not fully grasp the experiences of post-Soviet border withdrawing and reimagination. Indeed, in the majority of the studies that tackle the issue of post-Soviet borderlands and border withdrawing, a search for national sovereignty and independence came to be seen mainly through the rubric of nationalism and ethno-religious conflicts. Yet, as the material put forward in this presentation will hopefully attest, such frameworks have limited capacities in explaining the complexity of experiences and sensibilities that living on the national and imperial borders and peripheries entail. I thus think that it is crucial to see affects like shame as critical aspects of post-Soviet nationalism. I draw on the concept of shame in this presentation as developed by Elspeth Probyn. She, in her book, Faces of Shame, writes that shame, and I quote, arises from the collision of bodies, ideas, history, and place. And it can seem to get into our bodies, altering our understanding of ourselves and our relation to the past. Probyn talks about shame in relation to post-colonial Australia. According to her, shame in Australia is a way to deal with the colonial past that is today considered shameful and humiliating. Shame left by the Azerbaijani autonomy is similarly curtailed by the post-colonial reimagining of Soviet and Turkish powers. But unlike Probyn, who calls for the potential of shame to critically reflect upon the past, what we see in Azara instead is that shame left by the autonomy becomes the basis for its constant abjection. I therefore think that to speak explicitly about shame can become the productive foundation for the critical reflection on post-Soviet nationalism and sovereignty. Shame in Azara is connected to its long durée histories of regional tension and sensibilities. To be sure, the rise of Azerbaijani autonomy has been connected to the increasing centrality of modern and secular nation formation aimed at accommodating, but at the same time erasing Azara's Muslim Ottoman ambivalence within the nation. Situated at the southwestern margins of Georgia along the border with Turkey, Azara had been a peripheral part of the Ottoman Empire between 16th and 19th centuries, resulting in the conversion of most of its ethnically Georgian inhabitants from Christianity to Islam. So when Azara was eventually reunited with Georgia under the Russian Empire in 1878, it did so with a distinctive Muslim Ottoman heritage. In this way, Azara emerged as an ambivalent periphery, caught up between various imperial and national projects. In a context of the secular modernization of the Menshevik government within the First Democratic Republic of Georgia between 1918 and 1921, the status of autonomy, for instance, became a way of making this periphery a distinctive national terrain. This was done by inscribing in the first secular constitution of Georgia an article that recognized Azara as an autonomous republic open to intervention through Muslim religious public sphere. While autonomy politically and materially mediated religious layout of the periphery, it was, however, done so with enormous suspicion and protracted negotiations. In a way, the autonomy within the nation became a state of exception because it contradicted, challenged, and even made obsolete the secular pathos and orientation of the state. So while the autonomy to some extent held out an emancipatory hope for Muslim Azerians at the time, it also entailed a degree of shame for its subversive potential to modern secular nation. Soviet modernity was similarly materialized through erasing ambivalences by spatial reconfiguration of nation based on secular ethnic particularities. While all autonomous republics within the Soviet Union were based on the distinctiveness of ethnic culture and language, Azerbaijani autonomy emerged on the basis of religious difference. The paradox of creating autonomy based on religion within the atheist Soviet Socialist Republic of Georgia was a result of a collision of geopolitical interests over this place. It was an outcome of negotiations between Turkey and Russia in signing the Treaty of Kars in 1921 that recognized Azara as part of Georgia under the condition to secure Muslim identities. Soviet autonomy, however, became a means to homogenizing this peripheral region. According to Stalin's wider formulation about nations to eliminate colonial backwardness within the relevant territorial units, it was necessary to subject backward people to up-to-date nationalities. As such, although until 1926 Azerians were registered as a distinct ethnicity, in 1930 this category eventually ceased to exist and all Azerians had to register as Georgians. Becoming culturally more Georgian meant paying a significant moral, physical, and affective price, as the autonomy provided the basis for anti-religious campaigns waged against Muslims in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. These campaigns implied destroying mosques, banning Muslim headscarves, or forceful relocations to Asia, including my grandmother's sister, Izmian Tedoradze, Mamuchadze, whose photo you can see on the screen right now. So abjection of Muslim bodies from the periphery was in this way racialized. One example was that Azerians were referred as Tatars by both Georgian and Russian Orientalists to underline their otherness. And this term we know, and all of you know, I'm sure here, has been conspicuously racialized since the Russian Empire. So it is against this background that autonomy is a constant affective reminder of the continued trajectories of abjection to secure the nation. Indeed, abjection of Islam backed up by the autonomy allowed Azerians to contain themselves within the nation during Soviet times as secularized Muslims, but it left its affective imprints of shame on their spatial and bodily peripheries. Coming of age in Azara, amid the collapse of the Soviet Union, I constantly became part of these affective histories of autonomy and the sense of awkwardness around it. I observed how this unuttered sense of shame became suddenly more articulated in my own family with secular Muslim as well as Christianized biographical trajectories. So shame reemerged in my family precisely when the autonomy suddenly came to be seen as a bomb left behind by the Soviet and Turkish forces plotted against the post-Soviet nationality. Pridon Khalvashi, my dear grandfather, who was a famous Azerian public figure and writer, even wrote a novel entitled Can Muslim Be a Georgian in 1994. The novel indirectly tapped into these marginal sensibilities of shame on behalf of Muslim Azerians who saw themselves as proper Georgians, as they've been secularized and nationalized, but still remained ambivalent to the nation. A sense of humiliation and shame that the men recalled in face of Gamsakhourdia's statements in the beginning of this presentation, therefore, was familiar affective trope for me. In fact, these statements exposed notes of intersection and resonance between Soviet atheist nationality policies and post-Soviet religious reimagining of nation, which both rested on the objection of Islam through evoking the status of autonomy. So living in the Azerian autonomy amid the collapse of the Soviet Union was a felt experience, creating a very specific affective terrain of objection and shame. In Powers of Horror, essay on objection, Julia Kristeva argues that there looms within objection one of those violent, dark revolts of being directed against a threat that seems to emanate from an exorbitant outside or inside. The object, in other words, relates to what threatens the boundaries of both thought and identity. What is made object then becomes the basis for constant haunting, generating various affects such as shame, humiliation, fear, disgust, or anxiety. Shame in Azara is precisely connected to such processes of objection. It is a specifically modern symptom, a reaction to modern experiences of redrawing post-Soviet national borders and reimagining sovereignty. The question then is, how is shame evoked today? And what is its potential to critically reflect upon the post-Soviet nationalism. Anti-colonial nationalism in Georgia rejects both Menshevism and Bolshevism while self-colonizing itself through the tropes of Christianity and Europe. These tropes have emerged as main modernizing tools to overcome the backwardness left behind by the Soviet Union, Ottoman Empire, etc. Post-Soviet modernization is reinforced by severe neoliberal reforms carried out in Georgia since the 2000s, in the absolute absence of self-governing principles and public participation. In peripheries like Adjara, with its abject Muslimness and autonomy, this process has added yet another layer of shame, now related to inequalities created by neoliberal economic reforms. So shame in this context becomes a distinct peripheral affect produced by living on the global, imperial, and national periphery. It is a periphery that constantly rejects its own peripherality by, for example, conversion to Christianity, abjection of autonomy, or massive neoliberal urban change, yet still producing shame among those, it still produces shame among those who do not belong. So I will leave you here with this picture of never materialized project of Trump Tower in Batumi as a marker of continued trajectories of living on the global, imperial, and national periphery in Batumi. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tamta. Our next presenter is Jeff Sahadeo. Jeff is professor at the Institute of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at Carleton University. He is the author of Voices from the Soviet Edge, Southern Migrants in Moscow and Leningrad, and Russian Colonial Society in Tashkent from 1865 to 1923, and the co-editor of Everyday Life in Central Asia, Past and Present. His articles have appeared in Journal of Modern History, Slavic Review, Central Asian Survey, and other periodicals. He's currently researching the intersection between nature and society through rivers in Tsarist and Soviet Russia.
Thanks, Leah, and thanks to the organizers. I don't have a presentation, so you'll be looking at me for 15 minutes, and I'll just warn you that it's my dog's lunchtime, so if you hear some barks, that's what it is. I want to be a little bit more impressionistic, a bit more bird's eye, and think about some comments more broadly about the Soviet Union and nationalism. So again, it was a pleasure to think about this. It really takes me back to my own original interest in the region. I had started to become focused on the Soviet Union when I was an undergrad, and I started to hear about these republics during the Gorbachev period, Uzbekistan, Armenia, that had never occurred to me as a Canadian before, when we just sort of identified the Soviet Union and Russia interchangeably. Then we started to hear about things like the cotton monoculture in Uzbekistan, and I started to wonder as an undergraduate student if this was quite similar or not to imperialism in the Western sense, with resources being produced in the periphery for the center. And then this really got me interested in Uzbekistan. And for my first project, when I looked at Tashkent as a colonial city, but I started to see a lot of dualities in the way the Soviet Union presented itself, the way people understood it, and that's what I'll focus on for this presentation. My first impression, or my biggest surprise, I think, when I went to Tashkent, and this was in 1996 for the first time, was how many of the older men in the city were still wearing their World War II medallions or shoulder plates or different banners on their chests, which struck me as unusual several years after independence. And also that Russian was still the language of the city. And in fact, I recall some of my Uzbek friends, when I had to go to the police station because I had not registered properly, and I got into a whole good cop, bad cop thing with the militia there. One of the guys didn't really speak Russian very well, and was struggling, was trying to speak to me in Uzbek, which I was not very good in. And my friend said, oh, he's from the countryside, don't pay attention to him, he's like a village idiot, because he wasn't civilized enough to speak Russian, which again is something that I found unusual. So we can talk about this sort of mindset. I mean, I do want to problematize a little bit the idea of a Soviet empire. This might be something more for us to think about in the Q&A session. There was no doubt that there were imperial or post-colonial aspects of the Soviet Union. There was a core periphery system. There were, in terms of the economics, Moscow, Leningrad, the center of the Soviet Union, drew in resources. Manufacturing was primarily located there. High-paying opportunities were located in the center. So that's clear. It's hard to argue that you weren't better off if you were a Russian. I mean, that was also a marker that everyone understood. But at the same time, we can consider things that maybe we don't think of in terms of other empires, things like common citizenship. Even though Soviet investments in the periphery were uneven, they were important when you think of things like education, infrastructure, and there was a real effort to present the Soviet Union as a multinational state with equal rights for all citizens. Now, you could pick these things apart, and hopefully we'll get a chance to do that in the Q&A a little bit. But what I want to do is present for the rest of the talk my impressions of a so-called Soviet Empire or Soviet Union and nationalism based on the views of Soviet citizens from the Caucasus and Central Asia who I interviewed in 2005 to 2012 for my book, Voices from the Soviet Edge. And I wanted to start with a slogan that most of you have heard of. Druzhba Narodov is a Russian term, the friendship of peoples, it translates as. And I recall seeing this slogan first on the top of apartment buildings in Moscow when I first went there in 1992, along with seeing Moscow as a global city, which is something that really surprised me. Again, my impression of the Soviet Union had been to equate it mainly with Russians, and especially Moscow. Then to get to Moscow and see the city as one that was populated by people from not only China, Africa, different parts of the world, but from the Caucasus, Central Asia, all the nationalities from the Soviet Union were present in Moscow. It was a truly international global city. Still, however, I dismissed this friendship of peoples moniker as pretty schmaltzy. I mean, who really sort of talks about friendship of peoples? Maybe I was a bit influenced by my Canadian upbringing, when at that point, when we thought about French Canada and English Canada, about Quebec and the rest of Canada, we were talking about two solitudes, idea of distinct society. We weren't really talking about friendship at all, but we were talking about how to best manage difference. So that was the impression I went in with when I began to start to think about this project of looking at how people from the Caucasus and Central Asia who migrated, who left to study and work in Leningrad and Moscow, what they experienced, how they felt, how they considered issues of crossing borders, if they thought they were crossing borders, whether they be national, ethnic, racial, urban, rural, or other ones. And again, we could talk about a lot of this in the Q&A. But when I started to mention this friendship of peoples slogan, I was amazed at the emotional responses I got. And these were people who were not Russians. These were people who were sometimes from multinational families, and actually mostly from them, who would start to tell me that, well, the friendship of peoples means something to me. And not only that, but I'm an Uzbek, I married a Tajik, my cousin married someone from another family, they have children who consider themselves Soviet or whatever, and they went on to name a number of different national groups in their immediate circle. And they said, come for dinner on the weekend, or come to our next family celebration, and I'll show you the friendship of peoples. And a real sense among the people who I talked to of human relations in the Soviet Union, that at an everyday level, they're all Soviet citizens and they all got along regardless of their national background. And as I started to research this, I found that there were pretty concrete reasons why they did this. So it wasn't just nostalgia. And there was a lot of nostalgia. I was interviewing people in the 2010s when economic situation was difficult. I would also argue that people often have nostalgia for when they were younger, and the world was a bit more open to them before they had, well, I mean, they don't have mortgages in the sense that we do, but before they had families and some economic challenges. But still, to hear them talk about things like dormitories, for example, the multinational dormitories that came from a policy in the Soviet Union where every republic and often even autonomous districts in the Soviet Union were allowed to send a certain number of students to top universities in Leningrad and Moscow. And so no matter which university you were at, in these top cities, Leningrad, Moscow, Kiev, probably the three top ones in the Soviet Union, it was an incredibly multinational experience. And a number of students who would talk about this, both as an emotional one, that they really felt bonded to these people because they went through university life, they celebrated with them, everybody cooked their own ethnic food, but also these became networks that helped them advance in the future years after that, people who they could count on to go and stay in a city, to try and find a job that they liked, and so on and so forth. And the other issue that they tied to this friendship of peoples was one of freedom. And this is one that I also thought was sounded a bit strange, coming from somebody in the Cold War when we did not necessarily think of the Soviet Union as a place of freedom. But they brought it up in really two contexts. One, that the world was larger for these people in the Soviet Union. So if you're now in Kyrgyzstan or Azerbaijan, economically you're struggling, borders are closed. So instead of one Soviet Union, you've got 15 republics. It's harder to travel. It was more expensive, right? And the Soviet Union was quite cheap to travel. And that's another thing we could talk about as a Soviet policy. And also freedom in the sense of safety. And so freedom in the sense that they could go to whatever city in the Soviet Union they wanted to, no matter what national background they had. And they were pretty sure that they could walk the streets and not be harassed and not be racially discriminated against. And that's was not the case at the time I was interviewing. So I would hear people when I asked them at the end about their identities, how do you feel, what's your sort of background? The number of people who would look at me and tell me, and this is again, 2005 to 2012, I was a Soviet citizen and I still am one. Now, that's not to say that this common Soviet identity precluded ethno-nationalism. And in some ways it did lay the ground for it. So the privileges of the friendship of peoples were based on the existence of discrete nationalities. And there were certainly hierarchies there, and everyone was well aware of them. And obviously it was the Russians at the top, and I could talk about this for a long time, but I won't. But then there were the next tiers, and Tamta's presentation was great on this to highlight that if you were Georgian, so Georgia was a Union Republic, so the next tier down, territorially and sort of ethnically from Russians, you had a greater advantage than if you were a Jarin, or if you were from either a smaller nationality that the state recognized because they had officially recognized nationalities, or sometimes identities that were not recognized as national ones. So national identity became tied not just to who you were, because it was on your passport, it's a discrete line, the so-called fifth line of your passport, but your nationality gave you certain privileges in terms of, now I talked about university spots, political appointments, places in administration. Often these things were tied to your national background. And also with these ethnic identities came stereotypes and differences that could be exploited. So there was kindling there. And we've already heard from our previous presenters about national demonstrations that came up even before the perestroika period, and especially in the perestroika period. And you get that compounded by leadership decisions in the 1970s and 1980s to continue to favor the Slavic core at the expense of the periphery. Now, in my book, I argue against this so-called stagnation myth of the Brezhnev era. There was a lot going on in terms of science, technical and educational achievements, but they were uneven. And in the peripheries, this unevenness became toxic. So I would hear from my colleagues that or my interview subjects that one of the things they hated, and ironically, one reason they left, say, Tashkent or Baku to go to Moscow was that in Moscow they felt that they were more equal than in their own national capital, because in these national capitals there was a strong ethnic Russian minority. And the Russians were the ones who had the professional jobs. They were the doctors. They were even the chauffeurs. They had their own, whatever professions they dominated were the more prestigious ones. And another thing I think that provided this kindling was the Soviet system of providing, for Moscow being the arbiter between all these national republics for political disputes. So if Georgia and Azerbaijan had a dispute, or two neighboring countries had a dispute over water resources, borders, these kinds of things, it would be settled in Moscow generally. They would both make their presentations to the Soviet leadership. So there were discouragements from working together. And I think you see that when these neighboring republics are struggling to work together now, even as they also have a common background. And that's the next thing I just want to talk about in the last couple of minutes I have. I mean, Moscow played a different role for my historical subjects, again, these migrants to southern republics, because, and you look at the leaderships, and might be changing now that we're sort of 30 years out, believe it or not, but the leaderships from all of these republics, whether it be Lithuania, whether it be Uzbekistan, they were all educated in Leningrad or Moscow, generally, or had long stages there. This was sort of their cultural, sort of their second cultural background, if not their first, because many of them went to Russian language schools. So there's certain common language that they speak that I think did tamp down sort of the countervailing pressure against some what might have been potentially more national conflagrations that we might have thought might happen in Central Asia or in the Caucasus, outside of course Nagorno-Karabakh and others, with the number of ethnic nationality groups, the way the Soviet Union had these sort of smaller units within larger republics. So I think there were countervailing pressures. So just to conclude, I do see Moscow as having this really dual, and continuing to have this dual meaning for people from the region, for the way borders are constructed. I mean, it was a colonial exercise in the one sense, but also the Moscow and the Soviet Union and the Russians who were leading it were trying in a way to nurture a certain ethnic identity that would be part of this friendship of peoples, and that would lead to an idea of modern citizenship, with the idea that being national and having a national language was something that was modern. But in doing so, even if it wasn't, I would argue it's not specifically done to divide and conquer, as a lot of the literature might argue, it did have this effect of tying your ethnic and national identity to certain characteristics and behaviors, as well as to certain career paths and certain openings, depending on where you lived and who you were. So when we move to the post-colonial period, you see so many different legacies now that we can talk about in the Q&A. For example, these economic divergences that were left over from the Soviet Union continue, and that's really one of the things that fuels this mass migration when you see so many people from Azerbaijan, Tajikistan, different republics who are going to Moscow now and to Russian cities. Economic divergences versus demographic differences too, that were clear in the 1970s and 80s, and the Soviets knew this was coming. Moscow again is giving both a global view and a national view to citizens from the Soviet Union. And finally, that the idea that Moscow was a place that could be seen as an area to resolve differences, but bypassing sort of natural channels for ethnic nationalities to try and resolve them with each other, not through sort of the Russian so-called big brother that was advertised as a way, starting with Stalin, as a leading nationality in the Soviet Union. Even today, more in Central Asia maybe than the Caucasus, but you still see this sort of mentality that the Russians were the leading nationality and the culture and civilization in a modern sense were drawn, much of it was drawn from Russia. So I'll stop there. Thanks, everyone. I look forward to your questions.
Thanks so much, Jeff. Our final presenter today is Anna Whittington, a Mellon postdoctoral fellow at Washington University in St. Louis. Anna is working on her first book manuscript, Repertoires of Citizenship, Inclusion, Inequality, and the Making of the Soviet People, based on her 2018 dissertation at the University of Michigan. She's also working on a second book project on censuses in the Russian Empire and Soviet Union. Both projects draw on multilingual archival research in Russia, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia.
Thank you so much, Leah, for the introduction. So I've titled my contribution to this fascinating discussion on borders and sovereignty, An Anxious Unraveling. And my focus today is going to be on changes in popular moods during perestroika. I'm going to start my story in December 1986, when the sudden dismissal of Muhammad Konayev from his position of first party secretary of the Kazakhstani Communist Party and his replacement by the ethnic Russian Gennady Kolman triggered days of protest in Almaty, the Republic capital. In subsequent weeks, Mikhail Gorbachev's offices were flooded with incoming mail. Among Kazakhs came a resounding refrain: an ethnic Kazakh should rule Kazakhstan. In the words of an anonymous 7th grader, each republic should be led by someone born in the republic, who knows the rights of the people so that the leaders of the republic align with ethnicity. A Kazakh for Kazakhstan, a Georgian for Georgia, an Estonian for Estonia, and so on. In letters to leaders, non-Russians stressed the failure of nationalities policy and protested the declining sovereignty of non-Russian republics. Citing limited native language education and the prominence of Russian and Russians in republic and all union institutions, letter writers called for more local autonomy. In even greater numbers, Russians addressed party state leaders with a different framing of conditions, suggesting that the problem was not, in fact, a question of insufficient republic sovereignty, but of the opposite. In short, Russians complained, non-Russians had gained too much ground. Many bemoaned the lack of an ethnic Russian republic and the presence of non-Russians in historic Russian territories, as many sought themselves to relocate to Russia. We often think of today's topic, borders and sovereignty, primarily in the realm of post-Soviet states. In short, the Soviet collapse transformed internal borders into international ones. States would then project their authority, and citizens responded to and negotiated their new realities. Today, like my fellow panelists, I'd like to extend this timeline using perestroika-era letters, like the one I just cited, to frame the final Soviet years as a time when citizens were already emotionally engaging with the prospect of disintegration. From hundreds of letters to Gorbachev and Yeltsin that I've collected, I'd like to suggest that the Soviet Union's final years were characterized by a naturalization of ethnic and political difference in the eyes of many citizens who anxiously observed growing rifts. This recognition of the significance of republic borders created a blueprint for collapse as citizens, Russians and non-Russians alike, clamored for protection and envisioned a more nationalized Soviet Union. Although this polarization did not cause the collapse, it lent a certain legibility to newly forming independent states, endowed with characteristics that citizens either decried or demanded in the late 1980s. I'm going to focus my remarks today in two directions. First, I'm going to look at how citizens grappled with the symbolic value of republics, considering representation and language use. And I'm then going to turn to advocates of border changes and population transfers to reconstitute homogenous communities. But first, I want to briefly set the scene, echoing some of the comments that Jeff has already made here. After the revolution, internal borders represented a contentious arena of nationalities policy. Leaders and citizens negotiated the form and function of ethno-territorial units. In the 1920s and 30s, development featured at the heart of nationalities policy As leaders in Moscow, local elites, and citizens together collaborated on border drawing and the fleshing out the purpose of nationally delimited space. The post-war period saw a decline in republic sovereignty, including cross-republic economic integration, migration that blurred the distinctions between republics, and language policies that subtly or not so subtly relegated non-Russian languages to secondary status. This is what was going to set the stage for reform and renewal in the 1980s. So what was it that citizens wanted with respect to the national question? I want to first start on symbolic demands. Many citizens were concerned with questions of representation. This was particularly true among Kazakhs after Konaev's 1986 dismissal. In outrage, many demanded that Gorbachev reconsider the appointment of an ethnic Russian. Wrote one anonymous letter writer, "I write with such indignation that there is no limit to this indignation. Is there no Kazakh worthy in all of Kazakhstan who could rule our Republic of Kazakhstan? Why such humiliation? As I understand it, no one is selected to rule the Republic but the worthy. It turns out in our time, there are no such people, that is, of the Kazakh nation. I am not a nationalist, but if I am not ruled by my nation, then all of us Kazakhs are worthless. What national republic is ruled by another nation? Can you name such a republic?" For this letter writer and others, the current state of affairs represented an abrogation of the party state's long established duty towards ethnic minorities. In Kazakhstan and elsewhere, non-Russians called on leaders to ensure their representation. For many, though, it was not merely the fact of representation, but what sort of representation the state ought to promote. Many were concerned with the status of national languages, particularly in Belarus, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan, where the number of non-Russian schools had fallen precipitously by the 1980s. The letter writer I just cited, for example, complained of Russification among Kazakhs. A collective letter from Kiev blamed Ukrainian schools for enabling the Republic Politburo to become unfamiliar with Ukrainian language and culture, a situation that they interpreted as what they called the expulsion of the language from the capital of Ukraine. Belarusian activists similarly demanded Belarusian be restored to a working language in party state institutions, a common refrain among non-Russians. Across the Soviet Union, these movements found voice in the passage of language laws in 1989, which granted official status to Republic languages. Not surprisingly, Russians often reacted negatively. Within non-Russian republics, many complained of discrimination and of non-Russians' overrepresentation. Some beseeched leaders to recognize Russian as the official all-union language. Many feared, not unreasonably, that the 1989 language laws would exclude them from universities and employment, relegating them to second-class citizens. Even as they protested, their letters showcased an awareness that non-Russian republics carried more significance in a nationalized and polarized Soviet Union. While most Russians negatively evaluated non-Russian mobilization, most held different opinions when it came to Russia. Indeed, countless letters bemoan the lack of a truly Russian republic, that is, a territorial unit designed explicitly for ethnic Russians. This collective letter from Moscow, for example, demands that Gorbachev create a Russian republic where Russians will be able to preserve their hearth of culture with a capital in Moscow. Are Russian people not worthy of the creation of their own republic with all the institutes that other Union republics have? The Russian people has found itself unequal in relation to other national republics, which have their own central committees of communist parties, academies of science, KGBs, academies of artists, other institutes, and capital cities. This particular letter employed a strategy that was common among those demanding Russian sovereignty, blaming Jews for taking over Soviet institutions, denying Russians of opportunities. Such views aligned with the extreme elements of Russian nationalism, which was growing in force during the 1980s. But whether or not letter writers drew on anti-Semitism, the notion that Russians too needed protection and representation in their own republic remained commonplace. Advocates of expanded national representation and language rights focus primarily on the power of republics to provide for citizens' symbolic and cultural needs. Many letter writers, however, believe that the state should go further. adjusting people and/or borders to ensure that republic boundaries corresponded with existing populations. They utilized an array of strategies that offered new interpretations of the state's long-standing vision of matching people with borders and a skepticism of multi-ethnic communities, which were now seen as a source of conflict and violence. The most extreme versions of this involved expulsions. Non-Russians were rarely forthcoming about expelling Russians and other minorities in letters to Moscow, but a 1989 report did indicate widespread anti-Russian content in their letters. Russians in peripheries, however, complained frequently of growing antipathy from their non-Russian neighbors. One typical letter from Samarkand, Uzbekistan noted, "We constantly hear, 'Depart for your Russia.' Our desire is to depart from the Republic to the RSFSR as soon as possible, saving the lives of our children. And we ask for your attention on this question immediately. Soon it will be too late." Many cited the risk of violence, particularly in the aftermath of civil unrest, although it was typically non-Russian minorities and not Russians who bore the brunt of nationalist violence. In hundreds of similar letters, Russians petitioned to relocate to Russia, where many believed that they would be better protected. Many volunteered educational and professional credentials, hoping their skill sets might aid resettlement. Some would-be migrants feared that their prospects were directly threatened by non-Russians in historically Russian territories. As one collective letter from Russian women in Baku noted, "All of Russia is settled by Armenians, Azerbaijanis, Turks, and other nations, but Russians have nowhere to go. We don't have money like Armenians. Why does Russia so freely give away its best cities and places to ethnic minorities, forgetting about its Russian people, who have done so much for the flourishing of national republics? We are now in extreme poverty." Many demanded that non-Russians in Russia be returned to their own republics to make room for Russians who would be returning from peripheries, alluding to and reinforcing hierarchies among Soviet peoples. The most extreme articulations came in Russians' letters from Central Asia and the Muslim Caucasus, where their words were often inflected with racializing language and Islamophobia. While letters more commonly advocated moving people across republic boundaries as the best strategy for reinstating the national integrity of republics, some letter writers recommended adjusting internal borders instead. Ethnic Tajiks in Samarkand and Bukhara, Uzbekistan, for example, petitioned for their regions to be moved into Tajikistan, where leaders were more interested in promoting Tajik interests. Others called for self-determination for the Armenian majority of Nagorno-Karabakh in Azerbaijan. Together, such letters suggest that citizens had widely internalized Soviet understandings of the utility of national republics as guarantors of citizens' rights. More than ever, however, they believed that only mono-national republics could guarantee safety and peace, a far cry from their memories of an idealized past in which citizens lived in harmony. So I want to offer a few closing remarks before we turn to our larger discussion. For most letter writers in the Soviet Union's final years, the imminent collapse remained unthinkable, or at least highly unlikely. Though some hinted at the possibility of dissolution, for most it served merely as a device for demanding that leaders take action to address urgent crises. At the same time, it was also manifestly clear that existing arrangements were not working, particularly in interethnic relations. For many, the 70-year experiment in promoting interethnic friendship and unity was failing. Many sought to reestablish homogenous communities, achieved by expelling those who did not belong and/or by returning to their own ancestral homelands, where their rights and interests would be protected. For such letter writers, the solution to the country's escalating crises lay in a return to an imagined past, one in which people lived in their ancestral homelands, where everyone spoke the same language and enjoyed the same right to representation, perhaps, though not necessarily, united nominally under the larger banner of the Soviet Union. Late Soviet letters help us see that the process of post-Soviet border delimitation began long before independent states began projecting authority after the collapse. Citizens were already confronting social rifts in the late 1980s. As letter writers reimagined more sovereign republics, they also drew on decades of policy and ideology. Since the revolution, leaders had emphasized the flourishing of nations that had been made possible by the country's unique administrative structure, its commitment to promoting all peoples, and its neo-traditional understandings of the nation. Though post-war policies blurred distinctions between republics, their continued existence invited reflection on their long-term purpose. As Glasnost encouraged citizens to address problems openly, republics offered a ready-made solution for addressing long-standing inequalities. Revitalized republics, endowed with greater authority to represent national interests, were embraced as guarantors of citizens' rights. As tensions escalated, citizens recognized the significance of republic boundaries and the implicit political, linguistic, ethnic, and even racial differences that existed or ought to exist on either side. At one extreme, leaders' inability to address spiraling crises led some to see independence as the only viable solution. But even those who took more moderate positions envisioned more sovereign republics, at least their own, that would be endowed with expanded capacities to protect their interests. As citizens anxiously confronted a more divided world of strengthened republics, the emotional processes of unraveling the 70-year union were already well underway. With that, I look forward to our discussion.
Thanks so much, Anna. Our discussant today is Faith Hillis. Faith is Associate Professor of History at the University of Chicago, and she is the author of Children of Rus, Right Bank Ukraine and the Invention of a Russian Nation, and most recently of Utopia's Discontents, Russian emigres and the quest for freedom from the 1830s to the 1930s, which will be published by Oxford University Press. It's coming out, I believe, imminently. In 2018, 2019, she was a fellow at the Coleman Center for Scholars and Writers at New York Public Library. Her research has been supported by the NEH, ACLS, IRX, and NCER, and the Fulbright Hays program, among others. Thank you, Kate.
Yeah, and thank you so much to all of our panelists. This was an utterly fascinating panel, and it's also, I think, the most international of these events we've done with representation from 4 countries. So thank you, terrific work. And I'm going to just very briefly draw out 3 common themes that I saw in the presentation to encourage discussion among the participants. But I want to go ahead and also encourage our viewers to continue to submit questions via the Q&A function, because we'll have time for conversation from the audience as well. So the first theme that jumped out at me here was the question of chronology. And I think until very recently, when Soviet historians or political scientists talked about nationalism and nationality, it was usually implicit they were talking about the 20s and 30s, that they were talking about korenizatsiya. And only more recently has our chronological time frame expanded. And I think all of the panelists made the point that this needs to be understood as a dynamic and ongoing process that's unfolding over the course of decades, and in some cases centuries, not just a few years. So we saw World War II as one important breaking point that came out. We saw the late Soviet period with the student migration and labor migration that Jeff mentioned. I should also mention an important new book by Krista Goff, I think, looks at this late Soviet period as a crucial moment of nation making. We also saw Anna's presentation pinpointed perestroika, and then all of the presentations in some ways dealt with this collapse period around 1991. So the first common question I would ask to all the panelists is, where would you draw, of all of these periods, which do you see as the most important break, in addition to these continuities that we've talked about, or breaks? Maybe we should talk about multiple breaks. The second theme that jumped out at me here was that I think each of our panelists is proposing new ways of writing histories of border making, or of making sense of border making for those who are not historians. Again, traditionally, I think accounts of Soviet border making had focused on the economy, had focused on language and ethnicity, But among the new rubrics that we had introduced here, very intriguingly, Tamta talked about the role of religion and what does it mean to use religion to demarcate groups in an officially anti-religious state. We also saw international relations as a factor here, specifically Soviet relations with Turkey and Iran. There are certainly other cross-border stories to be told about different regions. Again, in Tamta's presentation, we also had an argument for emotion, for bringing emotion into these political histories, that politics alone can't explain it. And I think Anna's letters, actually, the emotion that comes through there nicely makes this point as well. And then finally, we have this issue of public opinion in these newspaper articles and letters. And then in Jeff's accounts, we have not only the question of border making, but also the question of border crossing and how these borders can also be maybe deconstructed or challenged. So for me, the takeaway is that our panelists are suggesting that there's a new cast of characters that needs to be incorporated into these stories of border making, border destruction, border redefinition. So we're primarily here not talking about state actors or ethnographers or economists. We're really looking at how borders are defined and challenged from below, in some cases from 7th graders, as we saw in Anna's account. And the other thing that struck me here is we have a lot of attention to this border making process from the vantage point of the republics itself. And while Jeff made the point that certainly Moscow has a lot of power, we're seeing this as a local process as well. So I guess the question I'd pose here is how you would propose to reconcile sort of what's happening from above in this period, or the periods we're focusing on, and then what is happening from below in terms of border imaginaries. And then my final set of questions has to deal with the nature of the politics that surround these ethno-national politics. So we really had, I think, 4 different brands of politics come out of these presentations. Altay talked about the creation of an absolutist dynastic nationalism. Tamta talked about Georgian nationalism as anti-colonial, but also deeply rooted in Christian values and in neoliberal economics. With Jeff, we saw the presence of imperial hierarchies and exploitation, but he takes the concept of the friendship of nations very seriously and argues we should as well, and also pinpoints the importance of concepts of citizenship and of Moscow as the global city. And then in Anna, we see this, I think, a really compelling new history of glasnost, in which we see the process of democratization and popular participation that's familiar to us, but here reframed in a rather darker vein, where we're seeing how these new participatory processes are giving rise to new forms of exclusion and ethnic stereotyping, and kind of, I think, unmaking the Soviet polity that Jeff is describing in his work. So my question here for you guys is, how would you propose putting these different stories together, to integrating, the different stories that exist in these different places into some kind of broader whole? In short, I think I'm asking, is there a collapse era politics that we can define, draw out, and describe? And then finally, I'm intrigued about the origin of these political ideas that you see circulating in these periods. I think one way of looking at these questions is saying, well, do they come from these internal national processes that we're discussing? Another way of thinking about it is, are they models imported from abroad? Is it some kind of combination of these two, of importation and local circumstances? Or rather, should we think of this as a zeitgeist? I was intrigued when Tamta ended with the image of Trump Tower, because as Altay was talking about dynastic nationalism, I think the implication is this is something Azeri, and I think Altay said this could spread to other former Soviet republics, but I think many Americans are now deeply worried about some kind of new dynastic nationalism that centers on the Trump family. So in other words, is this something just, is this a global style, actually, rather than a post-Soviet style? So I will end there and thank our panelists again for a wonderful discussion. And I'll invite you to respond to anything I said that you want to, but also to respond directly to each other if there were things in your presentations that intrigued each of you. Who wants to start? Should we let whoever's eager, hop in.
I'll start maybe if, if no one else wants to. And thanks, Faith, not only for the quality of your comments, but doing it on the fly, basically, because you didn't have our presentations in advance, and that adds an extra level of difficulty to everything. So, and I'll just make a couple of very quick comments, and I think then we can engage some of them too during the Q&A. But in terms of breaks, I'll just mention a couple that I saw that are maybe a little bit more exclusive to my own work, but we can see how much they radiated outwards. But I definitely saw a break, and this is when I researched my work on racism in Moscow and Leningrad in the late 1970s, early 1980s, when you had this large number of traders and people who were sort of not the generation before, who tended to be students from the Caucasus and Central Asia, or professionals who were coming to Moscow and Leningrad. These were more street traders, people trying to work in service industries. So they tended to be much more visible on the streets because they were trading streets, metro stations, and it. I know when I did my research, both in terms of looking at the numbers, the content, and the reaction to them, that you started to really get a sort of fomenting of racist ideas towards people from the Caucasus and Central Asia. And a lot of the racist labels, the Chorny, the blacks, and you start to hear those terms become more and more frequent. And then in 1990, and what I found in Moscow, and it's interesting then to sort of think of this in conjunction with Anna's presentation. In Moscow, it was 1990 that perestroika really hit in a negative sense, because that's when food rationing started. That's when all of these conflicts that were being seen, that were happening in Georgia, happening in the Caucasus and in the Baltics, really started to take hold in Moscow. And with the ethnic tension that arose from things like rationing and shortages, became very clear. So when you were talking at the end about trying to figure out sort of a broader collapse era politics, what I've always, not always, but what I thought of when I was doing this work was this idea of the center, the Soviet Union collapsing from the outside in, right? And so it's in 1990s, so I get these two blips in Moscow, sort of one in the late 1970s, early 1980s, and then one in 1990, and how that harmonizes with what's going on in the periphery, because these people are coming back and forth. And what I argue in the book is that Moscow is not the city shut off by passport regulations, but it's a real hub, right, for what's going on. So I think there would be something to writing some kind of periphery to core collapse narrative, right, in more of a mega sort of macro sense. It'd be hard to do, but really interesting. And a question about, you mentioned international relations and race, and I thought of this in terms of race, both in different ways. But like I mentioned, when I saw Moscow as a global city at the beginning, one of the reasons why the Soviet Union was so hospitable to people of different colors, nationalities in Moscow, and compared to Russia, post-Soviet Russia, was there was a foreign policy element to that. So there was, in the early 1960s, a string of attacks and murders on African students in Moscow, which the state really cracked down on. And the informants that I talked to said the state was very conscious of making sure that sort of so-called guests were not physically, it did happen, but I think they were very conscious of this foreign policy goal. And I think you can even see this with Putin in the 2010s, and that once he started to realize Moscow's importance as an international actor, the police were much more likely to enforce anti-nationalist attacks or nationalist attacks on ethnic minorities, particularly people from the Central Asian Caucasus, but elsewhere. And then I'll just make one final comment for now. I was struck by emotions too, because that was one of the things that I was not that surprised me the most when you're doing interviews, but it's something that you're not really ready for, right? You can transcribe these things, but it's when you actually talk to these people. And that's why Friendship with the Peoples became so interesting to me, because when you start to hear people talk about it emotionally, and I think that's another way if you start to talk about collapse era politics, right? Because it's not the case as in the 20s and 30s when there was really the level of hardship, right? In the Brezhnev era, people are generally okay. I mean, there are some exceptions, but people are generally okay, right? You know, you have a education, you have a house, or you have a flat, or you have electricity, right? You have the basics. So I think then emotions becomes a much more powerful motivating force, and we saw it run through a presentation. So I would say that might be another place to start.
May I? Thank you very much for your questions and for all of you for your presentations. Regarding the, the most important period, I think in Azerbaijan, it's kind of a little bit, again, a unique situation. We had a republic before the Russian Revolution 1917, after the revolution 1917, before the Sovietization. And this republic actually is a very important part of identity. And for example, if we compare with the Central Asian republics, as you know, even names were kind of invented after the Sovietization. Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, all of these names, all of them actually invented after the Sovietization of those territories. In Azerbaijan, it was invented as well, but it was invented before the Sovietization and then accepted by the Soviets. And the first republic in Azerbaijan even much more important than in comparison with, for example, the neighboring South Caucasus countries. And there is a reason for that. In Georgia, during the First Republic, Mensheviks were in power, and post-Soviet is nationalistic. So this is there's a kind of contradiction there between Mensheviks and the post-Soviet republic. In Azerbaijani case, in 1980s, the republic became a model for LCB, for Popular Front, for Pan-Turkism, and it was a kind of discourse to put against the Soviet, let me say, Soviet Republic. So in Azerbaijani case, I think at least symbolically, the Democratic Republic is the most important period for Azerbaijan, for this national identity. And now people will write that the Soviet Union appeared on the map just because there were 3 republics in the South Caucasus. Without South Caucasian republics, it could be that that all the republics would be the part of the Russian Federation, as it started, for example, with Central Asian republics before they were part of the Russian Federation. Then in 1936, all of this republics, Soviet republics, appeared on the map. So this is very important period, I think, for the identity. But strengthening, I think, the reemergence of identity, I think the second important period, of course, it's Khrushchev rule. And there was ease, and then suddenly the guys who returned from Iran after the Second World War, who were engaged in kind of nationalist propaganda in north of Iran, they came back and they became leaders of the Communist Party for 5 years, 10 years, but still these nationalists became the leaders of the Communist Party. And this period was especially important when it appeared, then never disappeared again. Was a little bit not as strong as before, but still it never disappeared and re-emerged actually during the perestroika time. Regarding religion, again, this is very important. If we compare, for example, Azerbaijan with rest of the Muslim parts of the Soviet Union, or, for example, compare Azerbaijan with the neighboring Georgia and Armenia. In Georgia, Armenia, religion is a very important part of identity. in Central Asia, if we compare, for example, both times, 1917 and then 1991, religion actually played very significant role. I mean, kind of religious identity was very strong. In Azerbaijan, religious identity was weakened for many reasons. One of the reasons is that, as you know, Azerbaijani Muslims are actually divided between Sunnis and Shia. So Azerbaijani, this as we call Enlightenment movement in 19th century, they paid very significant. They paid attention to this question because they thought that secularism should be the only kind of remedy for the reconciliation between Sunnis and Shias. And it's very important part of identity. If you take, for example, secularism out of the Azerbaijani identity, what will remain? Will remain either Sunni Turks or Shia Iranians. So this is very important that the secularism creates actually one of the factors which creates Azerbaijani identity. And the second important thing is that, when we talk about ethnic nationalism is in Azerbaijan was Turkic, ethnic Turkic nationalism, right? But majority of Azerbaijanis are Shias, and they are more connected culturally to Iran as Shia. So again, we see the contradiction between identity and religion, ethnic identity and religion. So in the case of Azerbaijan, and in both cases, when in 1917 the empire collapsed, and in 1991 Soviet Union collapsed. In both cases, we see that this ethnic nationalism became much stronger than the religious identity. In both cases, this it became the main, let me say, rival of establishment, and which eventually came to power. That's it.
Thank you. Tamta, were you wanting to go next?
Yes, thank you so much, Faith, for your kind of refreshing and illuminating comments and summing up our main kind of trajectories of arguments. It was really nice. So I will start with this break question, and where we will kind of which part in the chronology we can put more emphasis on what was more important in this break, which time period. And I think it's important to bring into conversation the factor of economy, especially in the 1960s and 70s, when the Soviet Union and economy of the Soviet Union, as we know, started to falter. And actually, this is one book which argues quite well and tries to reflect on this issue, is rights of rulers. I was trying to recall this name of this book by Kristen Lane, who talks exactly about this argument, how while the economy of the Soviet Union started to decline, the performative nationalism, ethno-nationalism, began to flourish. And this is the argument also made in Alexei Yurchak's book, when this performative ways of evoking certain national figures and establishing national festivals and festivals of different kinds of festivals, like in Georgia, for example, dedicated to different writers, and even evoking religion through more like a folklorized version of religion in those festivals, and like monuments and different kinds of architectural elements in the city, which kind of, so religion became more like an ornament and a folklore in the process of performing the nationalism, which was basically the nationalism of that time, of ethno-religious nationalism. If we kind of specify it more concretely, of course, was utilized or instrumentalized, let's put it like this, in order to somehow also deal with the economic crisis and kind of declining economic situation in the Soviet Union. So I think this argument is important to take into consideration when we talk about the decline. And that's when this dissident intelligentsia becomes more evocative. And exactly, Sviatkam Sahadeo is one of those dissident intelligentsia representatives who taps into or capitalizes on that performative nationalist sentiments. So this is something about break, but then maybe another question I can continue here, but we can maybe, I don't know if others want to answer about break first, because I have something to say about what is happening, how we can, what we can propose about this reconciliation of what is happening from above and from below, and I have a comment about it, but I can wait until this discussion will start to.
Okay, thank you. So Anna, thanks.
Yeah, I want to return to this question about chronology, or continue this question about chronology, because I think that it's a really important one to think about. And I think on some level, so I've worked a lot with letters in the 60s and the 70s, and of course in this period in the 80s. And a lot of these letters are actually quite recently declassified. So I've seen reports on letters, so I had a sense of what might be in them, but it's only when Ergani reopened this last year that I was able to actually see so many original letters. And having worked so much with letters from the 60s and 70s, I've historically had been so struck by all the things that Jeff has talked about in terms of thinking about what brought people together. I saw so much patriotism and expression of identification with the Soviet state as a whole. And to look at what's happening in the 80s is actually incredibly astounding by the time you hit perestroika. It's not just what's in the letters, it's also that there are so many more letters. I mean, there are just thousands of letters that are putting in. And I think that's one way of saying that I do think that when you hit this late Soviet period, you're talking about a state that is considerably different than what it was before. Partially this, I think one of the ways to sort of lead into another one of your questions in terms of thinking about how you make sense of it, I think there's a tendency among people who study this Soviet collapse to think, is this an economic question? Is this a political question? Is this a national question? And the answer is all of the above. All of these things are taking place simultaneously. It's the problem of economic shortages that are making people think, well, maybe my neighbor is getting access because he's Russian or he's Uzbek, and therefore he's doing better than me. And a lot of this is perception. Like I don't want to say that these are correct interpretations of what's going on, but in this atmosphere of shortages, I think it encourages a lot of people to think in very zero-term ideas about what is and isn't owed them. And I think that is what drives a lot of these letters. I want to say sort of the same thing I think in sort of response to Jana's question here about kolonizacja, because I also think that on some level, the 1980s are very different. At the same time, a lot of the discourses that are available to citizens who are writing to the state are the same ones that they've had available for decades. So I think that you can't necessarily see what people are writing in the 80s without seeing kolonizacja. And many of them actually, in fact, very directly invoke, like, we need to return to Leninist nationalities policy. I will say that there's I'll just say as a means of thinking about this, that there's some problem in the sources in terms of who actually chooses to write to Gorbachev and Yeltsin. These are going to be primarily Russians or other communists. So, a lot of the most nationalist sentiments only come through here and there. But I do think that you see a sort of larger connecting force that goes across. And then the last thing I just wanted to pick up on was something that Jeff said about thinking about collapse taking place from periphery to core. And I really like this conception, but I might want to think about that even more particularly, because I do think that you get a lot of dissatisfaction at the periphery among non-Russians in particular, and that has big manifestations on how the collapse is going to actually take place. I think a lot depends, though, on how you define core and periphery, because I think actually one of the worst parts, and one of the most damning changes that's taking place in the 1980s is going to end up being that Russians themselves don't think the state is providing for them. And when the majority group that has been historically privileged is suddenly feeling like the state isn't doing what they want, I think that ultimately ends up being a lot more damning than a lot of the nationalism. Of course, that's a response to nationalism. So I think that it's a little different in terms of how we conceive of periphery and core. I guess I'll end there to keep our discussion.
Yeah, we have great questions. So I want to leave time to answer them. I'm going to try to handle them in 2 batches, but you guys can respond to them and also to any other thoughts that remain on your minds at this point. So let me give you a few. We had 2 questions from Sam Coggeshall and Abigail Bratcher that are similar, so I'll lump them together. And they're essentially asking if, as people began to reimagine borders, if there were any demands to actually redraw borders, and if so, what those demands look like. What, like, where did they imagine the borders? Who did they imagine within them? And one of the questioners was also curious about what this meant for, as the Russian-led republic became a rallying cry, did that have any territorial manifestation? And what did that mean or look like in the 1980s? Another question was already partially answered by Anna, but maybe others have something to say. It was from Yana Skorobogatov, and it was if the nationalism of the late 80s and post-1991 years among Soviet non-Russians was a kind of accidental endorsement or yearning for Korenizatsiya, a policy that generated lots of resistance when it actually existed. And then finally, I wanted to throw out a question addressed specifically to Tamta from Gorkum Ademir at George Washington University. How does shame play out among young Muslim Ajarans in contemporary Batumi? Do you observe generational variations? So jump in, whoever wants to begin.
Okay, I will, I don't know, okay. Since the last question referred to me directly, maybe I will start and then we can kind of sum up the discussion with more kind of general comments on the border redrawing. So about the young generation in Adjara, so shame is the feeling which is very, it is shameful to talk about shame. So even it's not only in the Adjarian context, but in general, right? I mean, just to think about ourselves, it is always difficult to explicitly say about and then articulate ourselves. It's the same in Batumi and what I observed throughout my fieldwork, and not only my fieldwork, but I've been witnessing the developments in Adjara throughout my life, is that shame becomes kind of evoked and bursts out in times of crisis, and it becomes more articulated. And it becomes more haunting and tangible. So, like, for example, in 2017, there was a big, huge protest in Batumi, demonstration. The demonstration burst, and it was a spontaneous demonstration, and it was related to a very banal incident. So, Georgian police officer fined a young man for parking this car illegally at the shopping mall. And this incident, which was a kind of a banal everyday incident which can be kind of perceived as a banal everyday incident in the city, kind of instigated an enormous outrage in the city, and protesters demanded for the police officer to resign. And so in these interpretations of these demonstrations, a lot of times these young people, and most of the protest participants were young generation, young men predominantly, who would evoke, on the one hand, how this neoliberal spatial transformation confines the proper kind of movement and spatial, so they would kind of refer to spatial confinement. But on the other hand, they would also evoke this cultural argument, which would be related to how this police chief, who was from another part of Georgia, referred to these people and humiliated them by referring them being Tatars. So, and this term Tatar somehow re-emerges in Adjara all the time, and in times of crisis, especially now in the post-Soviet era of economic transformations, and young generations still react to it effectively, and with the sometimes with this kind of feeling of humiliation, which is attached to the term Tatar, which is racialized and which has been racialized throughout Russian Empire and then Soviet Union and afterwards. So I would say that now this historically referenced feeling of shame, which I tried to unfold in my presentation, is somehow imbricated with social, economic, and spatial anxiety, and somehow shame becomes like attached to the social inequalities, which becomes more intensified in times of crisis, and cultural identity becomes more intensified in these times of different kinds of crisis, and in this case, economic or spatial crisis in the city.
Anyone else have thoughts on these questions?
I can add in here too, in terms of popular demands on drawing borders, I don't see necessarily a ton of them, but there are some, particularly the most common one that I've seen is from Tajiks who live in the historically Tajik parts of the Uzbek SSR, who want their parts of the Republic to be recategorized as part of the Tajik SSR. And in part, that also is a reflection of the growing Uzbek national policies that are taking place at the time. Many of them complain that their passports they've been falsely categorized as Uzbeks, that their schools have been closed, and that's why they're sort of suggesting that the best solution would be to change the borders. I think I've seen at least some, you can see the same in Osh, which is an Uzbek majority city in Kyrgyzstan. And then a few letters that call for national delimitation for Nagorno-Karabakh, which is a de facto putting Nagorno-Karabakh back where it belongs in Armenia. So I think that you see some of it. It's not something that I see a lot of specific discussion on, but it is an ongoing thing that comes. And of course, a lot of these are questions that will resurface, and even with Crimea, about what land deserves to be, should be, historically belongs in what places. I think in terms of Sam's question about the popular contours of the Russian-led republic, I guess I'm going to answer that in a bit of a geographic question. I'm not entirely sure what's meant by contours here, but I think a lot of Russians are very concerned about European Russia, the sort of western part of Russia. In terms of, they're seeing particularly Armenian refugees after the earthquake and after events in Sumgait in Azerbaijan. They're seeing Meskhetian Turks being reshuffled there. One letter complained about Koreans. And, there's like really sort of, disturbing comments about, being out reproduced by non-Russians. That is also like extremely, some of the more disturbing letters that I've seen come from that. In that sort of mode, where it's like these historic Russian cities, very much oriented around sort of historic Orthodox Russian culture, that, when these cities are being taken over, that is where the problems are. That's what they particularly want to protect: Moscow, St. Petersburg, Leningrad, and other sort of historically Russian territories. And I'll just say, I guess here too, that like this conception of like, this is how it used to be is, obviously not based in any sort of reality. This is a very idealized past where people lived in these monoethnic communities. And, I think that's a discourse that's sort of made available, even if it's a sort of perversion of it by earlier state policies in the Soviet Union.
I'll just follow up quickly, because I think Anna said most of what I would have said anyways. And I did find also there was a large Russian nationalist press in 1990 that echoed a lot of these letters that Anna was talking about, and the idea that when the 1989, I guess it was the 1989 Soviet census was published, right, and Russians were just above 50%, and a lot of people just assumed that they were only above 50% because it was manufactured to get them there. These demographic fears really started to emerge very dramatically. And so a lot of discussion about being out reproduced by people from Central Asia and the Caucasus and what that meant for the future of Russia. And also the fact that Russians had all these health problems, alcoholism, things like that, being outworked. So on the one hand, the Russian nation was to blame for its own demise. And on the other, people from Central Asia were bringing AIDS and other diseases and things like that. So, and you see that, I mean, these newspapers were from Central Russia, but what's interesting is a lot of the racist tropes before the census came out were anti-Semitic. And all of a sudden then the switch comes to where people from Central Asia, especially Central Asia, but some of the Caucasus too, become the sort of enemies. And it would be interesting to look at the territorial ramifications, as Anna said, how much of it's European Russia. I did see some letters saying that, oh, in Siberia, where there's some narrative about Siberia is like the sort of hearth of the Russian nation, because that's where the pure Russians kind of still remain uncorrupted as well. So I do think that's really interesting. It's the Kornizatsiya question is a little bit harder to answer. I mean, I do think that there were certainly strains of people who still saw this idea of, as Anna mentioned in her presentation, that sort of maybe a Kornizatsiya plus. You could still be part of the Soviet Union, but you should actually have the Republic leader, not just Republic leader be an ethnic Kazakh, but there was this system that the Soviets had where maybe the Republic leader was usually an ethnic, but the sort of second secretary was Russian and the KGB director was Russian and things like that. So there might have been that, but I think it did evolve pretty quickly in these different republics to having a more sovereignty, I think, than was really imagined during Kornizatsiya. But I'll stop there because I know we still have questions to do.
Great. Okay, so I'll do one more round of questions. At the end of these questions, I think Leah has a question as well. So I'll let her tack that on the final questions, and then we can have a free-for-all in our last round. So we had a question about Tim Snyder's work on Eastern European nationalism, the reconstruction of nations, which thinks about the success of national projects in different locales in Eastern Europe. And I think the questioner is Howard Gable, who's interested in what allows national projects to have traction in the post-Soviet period in these various locales, what helps them consolidate in some places, and what keeps them inchoate in others. There were several questions for Altay. I'll pick one, which is to talk a little bit more about how nationalism affected minorities in Azerbaijan. And then there was a question about examples of trans-border peoples who maintain connections with both sides of an international border. Do they have some kind of distinct cross-border sentiment that differs from the nationals on either side of the border? And then I'll allow Leah our last word of the day, our last question.
Thank you. Thank you guys all for these fabulous presentations and Faith for your wonderful questions. I just have something that I've kind of noticed as a theme throughout all of this but has been sort of left out of the conversation is the question of internationalism. And I'm curious, like in many of your accounts, it's kind of punctuated by the moment of the late 60s. And Altay, you mentioned like 68 and like, the thaw and perestroika and so forth. So like in what ways, and then Jeff, of course, you're talking about Druzhba Narodov, so like an internal kind of supranational kind of Soviet sense of belonging. But in what ways does internationalism play a role? That is, in either kind of Soviet, the kind of opening of a sort of second international wave, connections with the Afro-Asian world in the 70s, or connections specifically like those with Turkey and Iran that you're talking about, Altay, and other connections with Europe and so forth. Like I imagine that some of the sort of connections between, I don't know, some of the connections between Germany and Georgia have played a role, specifically in terms of the neoliberal late capitalist development that you're talking about, Tamta. So how has the kind of economic forces, the economic instantiation of kind of globalization played a force in the construction of new nationalism?
So final round, who wants to get us started with any of those questions? There's a lot to mull on there.
And I'll start, though. I don't think the questions are directed quite as much to me, but transborder people I don't know quite as well. I do know along the Afghan-Tajik border, certainly there were transnational connections across those rivers that were were quite important. And I think Altay would know better than me, but I think around the Iran-Azerbaijani border as well. I mean, he talked about that a bit in his presentation. There's some straddling there. There definitely are some trans-border identities. And even now you sort of see between on the Russia-Chinese border, not ethnic groups, but there's some regional identities, I think, that definitely sprout as you get further from Moscow and Leningrad. And I think the question of national projects and what makes success is a really difficult one to answer. And if we did it in a pan-national sense, I certainly, when you just look at the failures in Tajikistan, the real prominence of regional identities and sort of regional clans, what makes a really solid political entrepreneurial network, I think, and can they reach their tentacles nationally? I do think those are often built from above as much as they are from below. So I don't really have a lot of expertise to talk about that, but I'll just finish with a question of internationalism, which I think is really interesting. And certainly I saw it in a lot of different facets. And I know that the sense of being a Soviet citizen came from the fact that Soviet Union was an international superpower. And a lot of people would cite that. They said, during the Soviet period, we saw our athletes triumph. We felt that we were a dominant nation country. People feared us. People came to us. And a certain degree of, and there was difference in the fact that the Central Asian Caucasus people, as in Moscow, would say, on the one hand, they felt themselves a bit more elevated over the Africans and the East Asians maybe who came because they were Soviet citizens, and there was certain racializing language to that. But at the same time, they were kind of guides in a sense, that they would help these people get up to the sort of status of being modern. So with Drushba and Narodov kind of radiated outwards in that sense, but also in a kind of patronizing sense, but a sort of a global sense too. And I do remember also that one way that the fact that the international was not available to also, it wasn't just possible to get up and travel across international borders. So it became very important who was able to go where. So if you were able to get a trip across international borders, that was a strong symbol of your importance to the state, of your sort of personal identity, of your professional success, and where you went. And I know a lot of the people from Central Asia, especially, would get very annoyed that whenever there was a conference in Budapest or Paris, all the Russians would go. But when the conference was in Delhi, that's when they would send the Central Asians. And so there was a strong sense of sort of how the international worked for the different nationalities. But just before I'll just maybe sign off now and say thank you to everyone again for your fantastic questions, and thanks to the panel. And I hope it will continue these discussions.
I've actually seen sort of similar complaints, except made the opposite direction insofar as among working collectives in places like Central Asia, where they complained that, when this workplace got to go represent abroad, because this was Uzbekistan, it had to be, more than 50% Uzbeks, but our workplace is only 5% Uzbeks. So it's unfair. The Russians the best workers aren't being represented. So I think you do see ways in which you get some of those questions of international representation. I wanted to think actually more about the question on transborder peoples. And I think maybe I want to interpret the question in a different way in terms of thinking about the post-Soviet transborder peoples, because I think, I don't know, you see in places like Osh, Kyrgyzstan, or, historically Tajik-speaking places in Uzbekistan, a lot more, a sort of alienation, both from the republic in which people live, but also from the republic to which their ethnicity supposedly belongs. And I think that historically was a really powerful identification with a larger Soviet identification. And many of them, I think these are the people that feel extremely sort of out of place in this post-Soviet world, that the sort of transborder communities end up being sort of left behind by like the growing nationalization of states within themselves. And I think that is a really, key context of understanding a lot of the conflicts that we see in the former Soviet Union today, not limited to Nagorno-Karabakh and in Crimea and other places, Eastern Ukraine as well.
We're right at our stop time, but I do want to give Tamta and Altay a brief word if they'd like it.
Okay, I will briefly answer Leah's question regarding the connection of neoliberal globalization and internationalism, right? In the context of Batumi and Ajara, but generally also in Georgia, it was interesting to observe how the narratives of neoliberal economic transformation became evoked and somehow started to be evoked from pre-Soviet past, where then pre-Soviet cosmopolitan composition of, for example, Batumi, in which is the Black Sea city, and with a very important port, which at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century served as an important hub to connect Baku to Baku with the West, and the oil of the Baku, to transport Baku oil to the West. And it was interesting during my fieldwork to observe how all these new investments in the city, which was manifested also in the huge buildings and urban renovation of the city, was somehow justified by the narrative of evoking and re-evoking or enlivening the real cosmopolitan flavor of the city and the tradition of the city. And in one of the interviews, I even remember how one of the bureaucrats, the city bureaucrats, said that this desire for liberal economy it actually comes from that past. So it's a natural desire, he said. So this Port of Franco, which was also part of this 19th century, let's say, capitalist intervention in the periphery at the time by the Russian Empire, which created a lot of inequalities at the time in Batumi also, and it had been in the press and at the time kind of reflected upon very critically how this Porto Franco created all kinds of inequalities. Those narratives and those imaginations of capitalism and cosmopolitanism, which is kind of in this case kind of brought together in order to justify each other, justify neoliberalism, for sure, to be correct, is somehow completely erased or nullified in the current narratives of how actually that Porto Franco or cosmopolitan capitalism also created all kinds of unequal trajectory. So this is interesting how these narratives, I haven't heard anything about the Soviet internationalism being evoked in defense of the global contemporary neoliberal narratives and cosmopolitan ways of life, because I think actually this neoliberal modernity, I would say, in Georgia rests on predominantly on erasing the Soviet past and on denying the Soviet past and Soviet internationalism for that matter. And thank you all for these great discussions and questions and reflections. It was wonderful.
And Altay, the last word is yours.
First of all, I will thank everybody because I can forget it at the end. So just briefly about the transnational borders. Well, I mean, let me say what I was something like 7 years old, 8 years old kid. When father showed me the map of the world, I was, a little bit shocked to see that, actually Baghdad is much closer to Baku than Moscow, because, this Eurocentric policy of the Soviet Union made us think that it's Middle East is somewhere, it's too far from Azerbaijan. And I was shocked just to see that Baghdad is just next door and Moscow is in such a big distance. So, but I will say what happened actually, and it's also very interesting. For example, before the Iranian Revolution, I think the influence of Iranian music, Iranian cinema, is really was very very strong. But the Iranian Revolution, when in late 1970s, early 1980s, we see that this VHR, video technology appears in Azerbaijan. We see the rise of Turkish influence, and people discover that, okay, we understand this language, and their films are so close. So, and now after collapse of the Soviet Union, there's no doubt that the Turkish influence on Azerbaijan is really enormous, because for many reasons. It's an education, it's cinema, it's soap operas, it's everything. So even we can see that even influence of Turkish language on Azerbaijani language. For example, younger generations, they use lots of Turkish words because they watch Turkish TV. So yeah, it's quite a common thing which is happening in Azerbaijan. Regarding the how nationalism affects the other nations. Faith just mentioned Krista's book. It's really a very interesting book. I advise everybody read that book. And so why I'm mentioning that book, because what's happening now, it's just continuation of the Soviet legacy, which started actually after colonization. It's the same thing, and I think Azerbaijan is not different in this case. It's applicable to all the former Soviet republics. The same thing in Georgia. It's the same thing will be in Uzbekistan and in the rest of the majority of the Soviet republics. How nationalism affects minorities. Thank you.
Thank you all so much again. This was terrific. So good afternoon to those in North America. Good evening to those of you in Europe and the former Soviet Union. And we'll look forward to seeing you at the next event in April. Thank you again.
Thank you.